I wasn't villainous. That's a detail nobody wants to consider because it complicates the story. It's easier when the villain is simply villainous. But after working and saving for over a decade, I bought my first building in Sunset Park in 2003. For a while, I was the kind of landlord people appreciated. I fixed things. I knew my tenants' names. Maria on the second floor brought me tamales every Christmas. I charged below market value because I believed that was the right thing to do, and I told myself it was enough just to break even. Then the market tanked, and property taxes doubled, then tripled. The insurance company dropped me after a pipe burst, forcing me to find new coverage at 3 times the rate. The boiler I'd been nursing along since forever ago finally gave up, and the replacement cost more than I'd made in rent the previous year. My accountant, a small, precise man named Gerald, who wore the same gray suit to every meeting, coldly laid out the numbers on a yellow legal pad and said, without drama, that I was going to have to raise rents or sell the building. I raised the rents. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd lower them again when things stabilized. But stability is coming is the first lie the market tells you. I decided I merely needed to get through this rough patch, and then I could afford to be generous again. The tamales stopped coming when Maria moved to her daughter's place in the Bronx. I told myself she would have moved anyway. Now I own 4 buildings. They're held by an LLC, at Gerald's suggestion, for liability protection, which is true, but also because I've found it easier to be me when I'm not technically the landlord. The LLC is the landlord. I'm just a man trying to make the numbers work. Last Tuesday, I got a letter from a tenant in my Flatbush building. She had written it by hand on pale green stationery. The handwriting was careful and even, the style of someone who had learned that presentation matters when you are asking for a favor. The letter explained that she had lived in the apartment for 6 years and that her daughter had just started at the elementary school 2 blocks away. She wrote, without accusation, that the rent increase I had sent through the LLC would make it impossible for her to stay. Could I help? I read the letter twice, put it on my desk, and left it there for 3 days. Then I forwarded it to my property manager with a note that read, "Per our lease agreement, please proceed." I didn't sleep well that week, but I slept.
I had done everything right. That's the thing nobody wants to hear. Because it suggests that doing everything right is not enough. Which is a fact so bleak that most people would rather believe I must have done something wrong. Yet, here we are. I moved to Brooklyn from Minneapolis 12 years ago with a nursing degree, a suitcase, and hope. Not the naive hope of someone unaware of how tough the world is, but the hope of someone choosing to act as though anything's possible anyway. I worked nights at Presbyterian Hospital for 4 years before finally switching to the day shift. I sent money back home, I got my daughter into a good school. I gradually and deliberately built the life the city promotes on its tourism posters. My Flatbush apartment was not beautiful. The radiator knocked, and there was a crack in the kitchen ceiling that had been there since I moved in. Painted over so many times, it looked geological, a Grand Canyon of deferred maintenance. But it was mine. As much as anything rented can be yours. And my daughter Hannah had grown up in it, learned to walk in its narrow hallway, taped her drawings to the refrigerator, and grown tall enough to reach the light switch by herself. One Thursday, a letter from the management company arrived announcing a 30% rent increase, effective in 60 days. I sat with it for a long time at my kitchen table. the one I had bought secondhand and refinished myself. The centerpiece of 6 Ramadan iftars, one very small birthday party, and approximately 10,000 homework sessions. I did the math the way I always do math, carefully, without wincing, because wincing doesn't change the numbers. With the increase, I would have $340 left each month after rent, before food, the subway, and Hannah's school supplies. I wrote a letter, knowing it probably wouldn't change anything. I wrote it anyway because I had been raised to try, and because I still believed, which was either my greatest strength or my greatest liability. I prayed that if I spoke clearly and honestly to another human being, something in them might respond. I waited 3 weeks. Then the property manager called and told me, in a tone that was neither unkind nor overly sympathetic, that the increase would stand and that, if I needed assistance, there were city resources available. He could send me some links. I thanked him, hung up, and looked around the apartment. At the crack in the ceiling, at Hannah's drawings, at the table I had refinished. I quietly began to calculate what I could fit in a storage unit and how much that would cost. I was not angry exactly. What I felt was something older and more exhausting than anger. I felt like a person who had been told very politely that I did not belong, that I had never belonged, that I had been a guest all along and the invitation was expired. That is the other thing the market does. It makes evictions feel inevitable.
I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it coming from someone who's been thinking about this for a very long time. I told Rod and Amara's story before either of them was born. Not their story exactly. The names were different, the setting was different. There was no LLC and nobody had a property manager. But it's the same story. A man builds a vineyard and all the associated buildings. He sets it all up. He goes away and hires other people to tend it for a share of the profits. When he sends someone to collect what's owed, things go badly. Everything escalates and ends in violence. I told that story, and people wrote it down and read it for 2,000 years. Yet, here we are. I need to be honest with you about something. At the end of Matthew's version of my story, the landlord returns, destroys the tenants, and gives the vineyard to someone else. People have read that as a warning about who's accepted in God's family, who's in, who's out, and who gets the vineyard. But that reading missed the point so completely that I'm not sure we were even at the same dinner. The vineyard in my story doesn't belong to the landlord. It doesn't belong to the tenants either. It belongs to no one except God. That was the whole point. That was always the whole point. Leviticus explains it plainly. God declares, "The land is mine. You all are the tenants. Every single one of you, the landlord and the resident alike, Rod, Amara, and even Gerald the accountant in his gray flannel suit. You all are tenants on a planet you did not create, breathing air you did not manufacture, drinking water that fell from clouds you did not summon. Don't even get me started on petroleum." The idea that any of you owns any of this is, in the most profound sense, the greatest collective sense of privilege the universe has ever known. Ownership is a story you started telling yourselves a long time ago, and it has caused so much suffering that I don't even know how to explain it anymore. And I've tried. You have to understand, I have tried. I said, "Blessed are those who have nothing, for the kingdom belongs to them." I said, "The first will be last, and what you do to the least of these you do to me." I said, The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And I meant it. I wasn't speaking metaphorically. I was a homeless itinerant in an occupied country, and I knew what it felt like to be at the mercy of a world that had organized itself around the comfort of a few at the expense of everyone else. I said all of this. I said it clearly. And then my followers built churches with parking lots. I don't say that with contempt. I say it with the specific grief of someone who believed, who still believes in the capacity of human beings to do better than this. I like to think my grief means I haven't given up. If I had given up, I would have stopped caring. And I find I can't stop caring, which is either my greatest strength or my greatest liability. I beg you to understand that neither Rod nor Amara created the system they find themselves trapped in, and neither of them alone can dismantle it. Rod is not a monster, and Amara is not a saint. They are two ordinary people caught in the same systemic machinery, one with slightly more power and insulation from the consequences, but both of them fundamentally alone inside a soul-devouring system that treats them as nothing more than fodder. Once I wept. Today I am devastated by your indifference towards each other's hearts. Knowing that about you breaks mine. The alternative to this monster is to decide together that shelter is not a commodity, that the earth belongs to everyone, that Amara's daughter and all daughters should be able to grow tall enough to reach the light switch in an apartment that's not going to be taken away from them by the whims of an unsympathetic, calculating market. The alternative is to create a system where Rod's genuine human desire to be the kind of landlord people think is worth more than what his accountant suggests on a yellow legal pad. God is not a landlord either, waiting to come back and redistribute the vineyard or give it to good people. God is the ground you're standing on, the air you're breathing, the pulse of your beating heart, and the impulse within you that wishes the story turned out differently for Amara and Rod. That impulse is the kingdom, and is already within you. It has always been within you. The question is whether you're willing to build something new with it.